A failed arson attempt, evidence is gathered, and the police are able to quickly identify a suspect.
This was a very violent, very personal attack. Any time that you see someone stabbed as many times as one of the victims was stabbed, it's a personal attack.
This was a case that shocked both investigators and the local community of Madison County, Mississippi alike.
This case made an impact on me just by the sheer brutality of it. What I know as a 30-year lawman, that evil exists.
This is the story of the brutal murders of Falonda Simpson and her daughter Davonda Washington, and how justice was brought on a cold-blooded, green-eyed killer. On a balmy June night at 9:52 p.m., the usual peace of Madison County is interrupted when the sheriff's office receives a 911 call from a local man, Walter Simpson, concerning the discovery of the bodies of his wife and stepdaughter at his home in Crown Road.
It was relayed that the Madison County Sheriff's Department had been dispatched to the scene of a murder that happened at 109 Crown Road there in Camden. They were requesting the assistance of the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, where I'm employed.
So let's see, Matt Holcomb responded out there and Russell Kirby responded out there relatively quickly, and there were other officers. It was nighttime, so whoever was on night shift hustled out there to get there as quick as they could.
Camden, Mississippi is an extremely rural part of Mississippi, and Mississippi is a rural state. You don't get much more rural than Camden, Mississippi.
Quiet farmland, hunting land, not a lot of businesses up there. It's just more farmland and large acreage where people live.
It's a community that is by itself. People that live in Camden are usually from Camden, and it's an agriculture or farming community, whether that agriculture be crops or trees. It's a real rural, small, tight-knit community.
You feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, and then it just opens up and it's all these green pastures and all this acreage. That's a closer knit area of people maybe than the rest of the county.
There's a lot of old houses in Camden. There are some trailers, but I don't know if I would say that there's a lot of trailers.
There are no hotels, desolate up that way.
They're mostly family. It's a small, very tight-knit community. You know, there's not a lot of violent crime out there.
Following the 911 call made by Walter Simpson, investigators make their way to 109 Crown Road.
I, along with a crime scene technician, responded to the scene. We arrived, assessed the scene late evening, before midnight, but after 9 o'clock. It was dark. Crown Road is a one-lane gravel road in the country, and it's not very well lit out there, and the house was dark except for the lights that were on in the carport, and there were some lights on in the house. There were other law enforcement officers that were there. The scene was being secured by the Madison County Sheriff's Department when we got there. Local people, including family members of what were later discovered inside as the deceased.
And they needed to secure the perimeter on the outside. The bodies were in the house, but they needed to preserve the entire scene, so they marked it off, because I think in no time at all, a lot of family and a lot of friends of the victims had shown up.
When we arrived, we went and began observing the outside of the residence. We made our way to the residence, and when we walked into the carport area, which was lit, you could see some bloody footprints, shoe impressions on the concrete underneath the carport.
There was a shop area out there, and I think pretty quickly, one of the investigators that had responded saw some bloody footprints going from the house, maybe out to that area, going to and from that area back to the house. So it was a murder. And once they went in and looked at the bodies, it was extremely horrific. The word I would use would be gruesome. I don't know that gruesome says enough for it. First of all, it's clearly a double homicide. You know right off the bat you've got a double homicide. And one of the victims was stabbed a few times. One of the victims was stabbed over 50 times. There was a hole in the skull that may be done by a hammer, blunt force trauma. You had all the stabbings all over the body, neck, face, lungs punctured. There was a smell of gasoline and their bodies were charred. About as gruesome as it gets. I've seen a lot of murder scenes, a lot of pictures. I've been to a lot of autopsies. This one was gruesome. It was bad.
Falonda was a good mother. Davonda was a good daughter. She was trying to go to college at Belhaven University here in the Jackson area.
Walter Simpson, who had made the 911 call, was the spouse of one victim and the stepfather of the other. He told him what he had observed. I think later he gave a statement.
In his statement to the police, Walter reports that earlier that day at around 3:05 p.m. he left Camden and made the approximately 90-minute drive to Grenada. It was when he got home at 9:40 p.m. that he stumbled over something while entering his home.
He gave a story. I love it when they give a story, regardless of what it is, because it's going to tie them to it.
June 2018, Madison County Police Department is investigating the murders of Falonda Simpson and her daughter Davonda Washington. When investigators enter the property, they are met with a shockingly violent scene. The bodies of the mother and daughter are found with multiple stab wounds and both have been set alight. The killer has executed the double homicide with a disturbing level of brutality, which has left the kitchen covered in blood.
There was a door to the inside of the house that was in the carport. We opened that door and immediately saw two bodies on the floor. There was a lot of blood that was on the floor that had pooled and already coagulated. We noticed that there was one female that was face down, there was one female that was face up. In the middle, near the body closest to the door, was what appeared to be a gas can that had been set on fire and melted into the floor. A lot of blood on the floor, a lot of blood cast off, which indicated that someone had blood on their hand or had blood on the item that they were using and were swinging their arms and casting that blood off.
There's blood spatter on the walls, so that told us whoever did this was angry enough, bringing the object back, and it was slinging blood on the walls. The victims were mother Falonda and the stepdaughter Davonda. They were both clothed in shorts and t-shirts, I believe.
I believe we were informed that there was a double murder, that there were two victims, that they were partially burned, and that they were stabbed multiple times. Falonda Simpson had been stabbed 4 times, and Davonda had been stabbed, I believe, 54 times, and that 18 of those were defense wounds.
There were bruise marks on the arms of Davonda, especially from where she was being stabbed, and lower torso and to her legs, and we suppose that she was kicking and fighting and trying to save her life. Falonda was stabbed in the neck and the upper torso. Falonda and Davonda had thermal injuries from the fire.
The bodies were burned from the floor, partially up their arm, but not completely. It was the worst one I've ever seen. It was nasty, gruesome. I mean, words can't describe it. The smell, the chemical smell.
This was a very violent, very personal attack. Anytime that you see someone stabbed as many times as one of the victims was stabbed, it's a personal attack. You knew that someone close to the victim was probably the one that perpetrated the crime.
Upon entering the crime scene and coming across the bodies of Davonda and Falonda, investigators get to work, analyze the home, and attempt to piece together exactly what has happened that day.
The doors, when we got on scene, the doors were secure, so it told me there was no forced entry. We believe the doors being shut to the house allowed the fire to smother out, so therefore the fire couldn't get oxygen and just put itself out. There was blood spatter on the walls. There was bloody footprints on the floor around the bodies, blood spatter on the bodies. It was obvious there was a pretty good struggle in that kitchen. That's where everything contained itself to.
With there being no signs of forced entry, the investigators begin gathering evidence inside the crime scene.
They're starting to collect some physical evidence there at the scene. I believe there was a lighter found there at the scene.
And I remember that there was a partially burned, looked like a roll of paper towels or something that they recovered that indicated to law enforcement that that was probably what was used to attempt to start the fire.
Bloody footprints going from the home to the shop, and there's bloody footprints coming back.
We noticed some broken glass in the home, in the kitchen area. We noticed the gas canister. We noticed the smell of gas in the air, the smell of death in the air, really. It's an odor that you'll never forget once you smell it.
They also could tell that someone had attempted to pour gasoline on the bodies and inside the home and tried to set it on fire, but the fire did not, it burned their bodies, but it did not take throughout the whole house.
So the evidence that we collected, of course, we collected blood samples. We collected the gasoline canister. We collected the bodies. We collected the knife after we found it.
Friends and family of the victims are questioned. The investigators are seeking any information relating to this gruesome murder.
Trying to get a story, get a backstory of what had happened, what might have happened, and how that all came about. Falonda's brother, Jimmy, was there. He was very distraught. His sister and his niece had just passed away, and he knew that.
Through questioning Walter Simpson and the friends and family of the victims, the investigators learn of how the relationship between Walter and Falonda began.
They met around Memphis, I believe, from a lady from the church introduced them.
They met at church, dated for about 8 months, and then married in April of 2017.
Falonda had found out prior to the day that she died that Walter had an ex-girlfriend that he had stabbed in her eye, and he'd been to prison for that. And she did not previously know about that, I guess right before all this happened. And she was really upset and really, really scared of him.
Walter Simpson grew up in Winona, Mississippi, which is a small town roughly 50, 60 miles from the Camden area. He had served some time in prison before. He was arrested in the late 90s for aggravated assault.
When Walter Simpson was questioned whether he had any criminal history, Walter stated that he'd been in a little bit of trouble for stealing a Snickers bar one time, and that been accused of and had done a little time for assaulting another woman.
Back in 1997, Walter was dating a girl in North Mississippi. They got in a big argument. She went to go stay with the mother. Another argument ensued there. The girlfriend went back to her apartment. When she went back to her apartment, she saw the storage room door broken into. So her and her son walk into her apartment. Out comes Walter. Walter struggles, stabs her, cuts her left eye out, assaults the son. The girlfriend's uncle comes in, breaks it up. Walter flees.
He told us that night that he was arrested for grand larceny and aggravated assault. And when we asked him to describe it, he stated that he stole some Snicker bars and arguing with his girlfriend, and accidentally she was cut in the face one time by a knife that she grabbed.
Turns out he had cut her eye out.
She, of course, has to go to the hospital. Well, Walter breaks into the hospital somehow, and once nurse staff realize an assaulter is in the hospital. They put it on lockdown, and Walter escapes. Walter is later apprehended after a police chase in that same small town in Grenada in a stolen car.
I believe got sentenced to 20 years and served a little more than half of that. I believe he'd actually served 11 years for aggravated assault for cutting a woman's eye out.
So he had done that before, served 11 years, been out and had, probably done pretty well for himself, staying out of trouble. But he's a violent man, and violent men do violent things.
After Falonda found out about the ex-girlfriend and his past and the fact that he was convicted of a felony, Falonda and Walter went to Memphis and lived with another preacher and his wife who was also over the church as well. And they lived in Memphis for a while with them. I took it as sort of like a extended counseling type. They were gonna go stay with their friends who were gonna help them through this. After they lived with them for a while, they moved back to Camden, to their residence, and they had not been back long when this happened.
Investigators are later informed that on the very day of her murder, Falonda had made some critical decisions over her marriage to Walter Simpson.
Family members and friends had relayed to us that Falonda had texted one of them to say, "Pray for us. I'm going to tell Walter that I'm getting a divorce tonight." And that was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that she had sent that text.
Shortly into the investigation, a friend of the murdered daughter, Davonda Washington, comes to the police station to speak with the investigators, providing them with some breakthrough evidence.
A friend of Davonda's, he heard of the murder. Him and his dad came to the sheriff's department, and the boy was upset. He's like, he did it, he did it. We're like, who did it? He said, Walter, Davonda's stepdad. Why did he say he did it? Man, he's been coming on to her, and she just tired of it. She texts me. So his text showing in that time frame, that evening of June 5th, shows that he come on to her, and Davonda contacted the friend that showed up.
I believe that Davonda had told her mother and showed her text messages that Walter had sent, showed her photos, and I believe there was even a video that showed that Walter had made some inappropriate advances towards her. Falonda did not approve and was going to tell Walter that she was going to divorce him. Davonda had messages on her phone that she was letting her mother know that, this guy's a creep and this guy's been making advances on me and he's not loyal to you.
So Davonda left the house, went to a local gas station, waited for her mother to come home with the family car. They were gonna kick Walter out. It was obviously they were gonna kick Walter out because when I got there was bags of clothes in the hallway, all bundled up like long bags stuffed with men's clothes.
We later learned that Falonda had put Walter's clothes in those trash bags and more than likely had told him that he was not welcome there anymore that night.
So they were gonna kick Walter out that day because they're tired of him coming on to Davonda.
It is at this point in the investigation that a family friend comes forward to reveal she had been on the phone with Walter's wife, Falonda, at 3:38 p.m. on the day of the murder. Falonda had been bagging up husband Walter's clothes whilst on the call, when all of a sudden screams could be heard down the phone line.
The last thing that happened on Falonda's phone is that she was on the phone with the woman in Memphis.
Falonda had confided in her some things that had happened, had talked to her about leaving Walter.
The woman in Memphis heard a scream.
And the phone disconnected.
June 2018. With investigators gathering evidence and witness statements relating to the brutal murder of Falonda Simpson and her daughter Davonda Washington, investigators turn their attention to Falonda's husband, Walter Simpson. When questioned on his whereabouts during the murder of Davonda and Falonda, Walter Simpson tells the police he was away from home as he had left that day to go to Grenada, Mississippi.
First thing we needed to do was talk to Walter, because at the scene, like I said, he didn't show any emotion. Later that evening, approximately 2:45, once we left the scene of the house, we interviewed Walter that night and spent about an hour talking to him. The interview was basically getting a background on Walter, then getting a background on Walter and Falonda, and then getting a background on Walter's day.
He left a little after 3 o'clock that evening from Crown Road, claimed to go up north to Grenada, Thunder on the Lake. He claims he went up there to go check on his haircutting license. Well, he claims the guy wasn't there. And when he came back from driving around Thunder on the Lake in Grenada, he drove back by the barbershop and bumped into the hairdresser. The hairdresser hasn't been in business. He was shutting down because financial reasons. So Walter would not have had any business being up there asking for a certificate. He told us that he drove to Grenada around Thunder on the Lake and was going to stop and visit his mother. Asked where does she live, did he visit her? No, I didn't visit her. I don't know where she lives. I didn't have her phone number. I know where my mom lives. Drove back south to Camden around 9:40 is when the call came in. He walked in the kitchen, and when he walked in the kitchen, he claims he stumbled over his wife. That's when he claimed he turned the light switch on. That was a lie. When you open the door, you still have another 5 feet before you get to Falonda. The light switch is by the door. He could have easily walked in, turned the light switch on, then seen the bodies, but he didn't walk in and stumble over them looking for the light switch.
At that point, I noticed some inconsistencies in his statement, some things that were just raising red flags on top of the red flags that had already been raised, stating that he had driven, an hour and a half to Grenada for a 15-minute conversation, that he didn't know where his mother lived, that he had been arrested for stealing Snicker bars, but was charged with grand larceny, that his girlfriend had accidentally cut herself in the face while they were arguing, and he was charged with aggravated assault and served 11 years. That didn't make sense. And at that time, I went ahead and read him his Miranda rights under the Constitution, and he agreed to continue talking. We talked for another probably 30 minutes. He didn't say anything to incriminate himself, but there were definitely some red flags that needed to be checked out further.
With rising suspicions of Walter's behavior and whereabouts on June 5th, the investigators turned to several vehicles located at the family home at the time of the double murder.
The car that was on the premises, it turned out, had a GPS tracker on it, and he had used that car, and it didn't match up at all with the story that he'd been given.
Law enforcement always run the car tag to make sure that car belongs where it is and to figure out what's going on with whatever's there. So they did that in this case. They found that that car had a lien on it. Oftentimes when a car has a lien on it and people are making payments to the place where they bought the car, it will have a GPS tracker on the car. So if they quit making their payments, they can go find the car and repossess it. That happened in this case. It was a lucky break for us. We subpoenaed the records, the GPS records. They're incredibly accurate. And it showed us that the story that Walter had told law enforcement was not true. They could tell by the track that car made that he did not go where he had told them that he went.
So Walter's original story, he'd gone to Grenada, Mississippi, which is north of Madison, gone to a barber shop, maybe stopped by to see somebody else, and then he got back to the house around 9:40 that night and discovered the bodies. The GPS track told a different story. He had been to Winona, Mississippi, and they were able to track exactly where he'd been to Winona, Mississippi.
They found that he actually went to a residence that turned out to be a family residence. They did a search warrant for that residence and the outside areas and found a burn pile.
That burn pile had burnt clothing, boots. There was a cap to the gas can that was recovered at the house in that burn pile in Winona.
When the charred remnants of work boots are found in the pile of burnt belongings, investigators immediately circle back to the bloodied footprints identified at the crime scene.
You could tell that someone had walked around in there, and obviously it wasn't either one of the women because their injuries they sustained. It was very clear that those footprints were not from law enforcement. They were obviously from the person who had killed them. When we figured out Walter's comings and goings after the murders, we figure he burned the shoes in the burn pile.
During the investigation, forensic experts collect and test swab samples and blood found at the house and in the vehicle.
There was some swabs from a brake and gas pedal of a vehicle. There was a swab of the driver's seat. There's also a swab of the seat control. There was a set of keys that were submitted, a water bottle that was also submitted, and I believe a lighter that was submitted to the lab.
There was a lighter from the dryer that was in the carport. There's numerous blood swabs taken. When I got on scene, deputies got on scene, Walter was talking. He was sitting in the car, the family car. FBI investigators swabbed the car. They noticed blood on the lumbar seat, the gear shift, brake pedal. He claims he just drove up, walked in, stumbled on the bodies. There was no reason for the blood to be in that car in those particular spots.
Ultimately, we discovered that the blood in the vehicle belonged to Falonda Simpson, and the blood on the water bottle belonged to Davonda Washington. There was a lighter that was submitted, and we found his DNA profile on that lighter. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's considered the blueprint of the human body, and that's what gives us our genetic characteristics that we can see on a day-to-day basis. For example, someone may say, oh, you have your mother's eyes, or you have your father's smile. Those are genetic markers that we can see. There's also genetic markers on the DNA molecule itself that we can use, and we can exploit that to make identifications and associate people with certain items of evidence. He may have had that impression that, the fire would have consumed everything, but I've worked several cases where people have tried to burn evidence and burn bodies, and there's usually always something behind that we can find that may be of significance.
Based on the roll of paper towels and the lighter that was found, and they could smell accelerant. When they put their bodies on the autopsy table, they collect whatever debris falls off of the bodies and put it, honestly, in a paint can. We could smell the accelerant still even years later. So they could smell accelerant, they saw the partially burned paper towels, and they knew that someone had started the fire intentionally. I do think he thought the whole house would go up in smoke. Fires need oxygen. His mistake was closing the door. Had he succeeded in burning the house down, our case would have been a lot more difficult because it would have been really hard to tell what had happened to those women.
You leave DNA behind everywhere when you sweat, touch something. It's unique to that person and that person alone. Blood was positively ID'd as being Walter's or Walter's blood type. The significant part of this case revolved around the GPS, the text messages, the phone conversations from the witnesses. We got the GPS coordinates that matched to Poorhouse Road, that matched that burn pile. We knew we had our guy.
June 2018. Following the brutal murder of Falonda Simpson and her daughter Davonda Washington, investigators are swiftly honing in on Walter Simpson, the husband of Falonda, as their #1 suspect. June 5th, the day of the double murder. At 2:30 p.m, Davonda tells her friend over the phone that Walter has been making sexual advances towards her, the most recent being earlier that day.
So Davonda had just recently disclosed to someone close to her that Walter had come on to her, made advances toward her, sexual advances. He had called her back into a room, exposed himself to her. She was scared of him. She didn't trust him. She was going to tell her mother, and she communicated that. Walter had basically tried to have sex with his stepdaughter, and she was having none of it, and she was going straight to her mother with it.
So Davonda left the house, went to a local gas station, waited for her mother to come home with the family car. They were going to kick Walter out. As soon as Falonda came home from her meeting from Lexington, she picked up Davonda at the gas station where Davonda left her car. They drove a few miles up the road to the family home. They started packing Walter's clothes because the garbage bag's in the hallway.
When Walter is informed that his harassment of Davonda was the last straw and Falonda is going to divorce him, events rapidly escalate and screams are heard by Falonda's friend who is on a call with her.
And then according to this witness, she heard screaming and then the phone hung up.
While Falonda's on the phone with her church member, she walks in and the church member hears a hollering and screaming. Walter kills Falonda.
He just did not believe that she would ever say no to him or leave him or anything like that.
The reason why Falonda walked in to the kitchen is because she heard what we believe she heard, screaming coming from there or struggle. She walks in and sees Davonda already dead on the floor. So Falonda, we believe, is the second victim. This was a case where sudden, onset anger, he didn't have time to go search for a weapon. It was there. He used what he had at his disposal, a large butcher knife.
Walter Simpson was absolutely a jealous man. You can tell that from his prior situation with his ex-girlfriend, and you can tell it in this case. He wanted what he wanted, and he wasn't gonna let anything stop him.
He loved her, or he wanted to have relations with her, and Davonda refused, and this has been ongoing. So he had that mentality, I believe, is if I can't have you, nobody can have you. So he killed her.
He was just mad that she had told her mother and that her mother was wanting a divorce. And I think that's what enraged him, was that instead of him breaking it off with her, that she was trying to break it off with him, which is a similar story to what had happened to him back when he slashed his first girlfriend's face.
With witness statements coming in, alongside the mounting evidence being found at the burn pile, the family home, and in the vehicles at the crime scene, investigators become confident that Walter Simpson, the sole suspect in this case, is guilty of the double murder.
After law enforcement had that official statement from Walter and they compared it to the GPS locations from the car, they knew that he was lying. They could tell that that car had gone somewhere he left out of his story. That coupled with Falonda's blood in the vehicle, Walter's blood on the lighter that was found under the carport. So all those three things together let them know he was about to be in serious trouble.
I think that his plan as far as burning the bodies and pouring the gas and lighting the fire to cover up anything that would tie him to the crime. But the house didn't burn.
June 6th, the anonymous 911 call that told us that Walter was burning stuff in a fire pit where he was standing there naked. That morning, still on June 6th, when we received the GPS coordinates of the car, that and the fire pit, we knew we had our guy.
Walter Simpson called law enforcement and was kind of hounding them about getting his car back. Law enforcement kept the car to do all their testing and all their search warrants, and they didn't give it back in case they had to do additional stuff to the car. So he was calling and calling.
Walter, we'll give you the car, but are you wondering where we're at in the investigation? Have we developed a suspect? Oh, yeah. Are y'all getting closer to find my family's killer? Yeah, Walter, we are.
Once they decided to charge him, law enforcement called him under the guise of, hey, come get the car. And when he showed up, he was actually arrested and charged with the murders of the two women.
We brought him into investigations. Said, look, we have a few more questions we need to ask you. We read him his Miranda rights. He decided he wanted a court-appointed attorney then. That's when I slid him the picture of his dead wife on the gurney. And I told him, if I have to look at these pictures, you ought to also. And that's when he pointed and laughed in a sadistic way, saying, ha ha ha, is that my wife? This guy's sick. He's the one that did it, there's no doubt. I mean, I've never met anybody like him.
There were no good qualities about Walter. He was all about Walter. He was an extremely jealous man. His jealousy had already landed him in prison once, where he served 11 years. He didn't learn his lesson from that. He's married to a woman, yet he wants her daughter. She refuses. He's jealous. If he can't have her, no one else can. And his obsessiveness with Walter's obsessiveness with Walter led him to represent himself in the trial.
I've had a couple of cases where a defendant has chosen to represent themselves. And it's always interesting because we never know where the questions are coming from or what they're trying to hope to accomplish by their questions. So it's always a bit different than if a seasoned attorney questions us. So like I said, in this case, it was a little bit different, a little bit interesting to see where he would go or what he would say.
But he had spent 11 years in the penitentiary, so he thought that he knew more law than a lawyer. And it's been my experience that those that have served time before usually think they are way smarter than they actually are. They watch shows like this and try and figure out what not to do and how to get away with something, and never works out for them quite that well.
And that's one of a prosecutor's biggest nightmares. You would think we would love to have people represent themselves. We hate it. You've heard the saying that anyone who represents themselves has a fool for a client. And Walter Simpson is a bona fide fool, and he represented himself. And the reason that's difficult is they don't know how to try a case. They don't know the rules of evidence. They don't know what's admissible, what's not. And when you've got attorneys on the other side, you make objections, they're ruled on, the judge is your gatekeeper of evidence. Here, when they're consistently doing things that they shouldn't be doing, a seasoned prosecutor does not want to keep standing up and objecting because you're afraid of what the jury may be thinking. Are you picking on this guy? Or are you being difficult? Or are you hiding something? No, he's just not doing it right. But Scott Regilio, who was prosecuting, did an outstanding job in the case, and he let Walter dig himself a hole too that he couldn't get out of. It was almost like he believed everything that he was saying, and he felt like that he had found a hole in our case, and it wasn't. He was arguing these times, and he didn't realize that the times that he was arguing was not even the same time zone that we were dealing with. He was arguing Eastern time, and how could this have happened when I was supposed to be here, and this, that, and another, and when in fact we were dealing with Central time.
Having people's cell phones and having Davonda and Falonda's cell phones, it was almost as though they could testify for us even though they weren't there. It was truly amazing that law enforcement found these text messages on Falonda's phone to her friend that told her, Walter tried to touch my daughter, we're getting a divorce, I'm going right now. And we were able to add those text messages to the timeline of when the car left the house from the GPS coordinates from the car, and put together a timeline of these women's day through their cell phones.
Walter showed no signs of remorse. He preached to that jury. He thought he had won the day, but he was the only one in the courtroom that felt that way.
On January 4th, 2021, Walter Simpson is sentenced to 2 life sentences for the 2 counts of murder, 20 years for arson, and 10 years for possession of a deadly weapon by a convicted felon.
He's got 80 years over his head, day for day. It's as good as a death sentence.
What I know as a 30-year lawman, that evil exists and people need to be protected. It's up to us to do a good job as investigators to ensure that these bad people are locked up and kept away from the public.
It is thanks to the brilliant work of the investigating agencies that Walter Simpson was placed under arrest so soon after committing his crimes.
Really proud of the law enforcement agencies for putting together a quick case and for us getting to the courtroom as quick as we did to put people at peace, that our justice system works.
This case is one that stands out, that they were able to get all this together this quickly and make this arrest so fast, that he was arrested within 3 days of these women being killed. I know that brought peace to the family, that the person who was responsible for this was going to be held responsible for it. I'm also sure that they were heartbroken that it was Walter Simpson. They don't all happen like that. And so it was really amazing that they worked so hard and got this one so quickly.
The Madison County Sheriff's Office has a really big area to cover, and they're a good agency. The fact that they were able to respond to this, put the case together as quickly as they did. Again, this is a community in Camden that doesn't experience a lot of this, so people are scared, they're nervous. And so to bring closure pretty quick as far as who did it, you knew there wasn't a serial killer out there running around. You knew it wasn't a stranger. It was actually Walter Simpson.
Falonda was a good mother, a devout Christian, and she believed that Walter was also a good Christian and a good man. Davonda wanted to be a nurse, I believe, and she was working hard to improve her life and be the best person that she could be. It's just sad that such a young person was killed at an early age for sick desires of an older fella.
This is one of the cases that stays with you.
I think there's justice that he will not be able to do this to anybody else again, and he'll spend the rest of his life in prison.
I mean, the person who's deceased is gone. They're not coming back. There may be some measure of satisfaction when someone gets convicted, but I think there's always going to be that open wound with victims and their families.